The morning sun blazed over the training grounds at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, where 12 of the Navy's finest SEALs stood in a line, each one gripping their sniper rifles with white knuckles. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez wiped sweat from his brow as he stared downrange at the targets that seemed to mock him from 800 yards away. For 3 consecutive days, these elite warriors had been missing shots that should have been routine for operators of their caliber. Commander Jake Harrison paced behind the firing line, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The upcoming deployment to Afghanistan was just 6 weeks away, and his sniper team was performing worse than fresh recruits. Yesterday's exercise had been a complete disaster. Out of 60 shots taken by the team, only 14 had hit their intended targets. For SEALs who were supposed to be the best of the best, these numbers were not just embarrassing, they were dangerous. Rodriguez had been a SEAL for 8 years. He had completed 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Syria, earning a Bronze Star for valor during a particularly brutal firefight in Fallujah. His hands, usually steady as stone when handling weapons, now trembled slightly as he adjusted his scope for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The familiar weight of his Mk11 sniper rifle, which had once felt like an extension of his own body, now seemed foreign and uncooperative. Next to him, Petty Officer First Class Danny Chen was having his own struggles. Chen had graduated top of his sniper school class 3 years ago and had never missed a qualification shot until this week. His normally confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by frustration that showed in every tense muscle of his compact frame. He had spent the previous night cleaning his rifle until every component gleamed, convinced that some mechanical issue was causing his misses. The problem had started during a routine training exercise the previous Monday. The team had been practicing long-range precision shooting, a skill that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure in the field. These weren't green recruits struggling with basic marksmanship. These were seasoned operators who could typically place bullets within inches of their target from distances that would challenge Olympic shooters. Commander Harrison had initially blamed external factors. The wind conditions that day had been tricky, with gusts coming from multiple directions. The temperature had fluctuated throughout the morning, which could affect bullet trajectory. But as the misses continued through Tuesday and Wednesday, it became clear that something more fundamental was wrong. Each SEAL had different theories about what was causing the problem. Some blamed their equipment, meticulously checking and rechecking their rifles and scopes. Others suspected that recent changes to their ammunition might be the culprit. A few wondered if the stress of their upcoming deployment was affecting their concentration and breathing techniques. Sergeant First Class Tony Williams, a veteran with 12 years of service, had even suggested that they might be overthinking their shots. Williams had seen younger operators fall into mental traps before, where excessive analysis paralyzed their natural shooting instincts. But this theory didn't explain why the entire team was affected simultaneously. The training schedule had been modified to include extra range time, but the additional practice only seemed to make things worse. Each missed shot further eroded the team's confidence, creating a negative feedback loop that was difficult to break. Harrison had considered calling in outside instructors, but his pride as a unit leader made him reluctant to admit that his team needed help. The stakes were higher than just training scores or unit pride. In 6 weeks, this team would be operating in the mountains of Afghanistan, where precision shooting could be the difference between completing their mission and coming home in body bags. The enemy fighters they would face were skilled, determined, and intimately familiar with the terrain. There would be no room for error when lives depended on every shot. As Wednesday's training session concluded with another dismal performance, Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He had heard rumors about a civilian contractor who worked with various military units on specialized training problems. The contractor's methods were unconventional, and some of the stories he had heard seemed almost too incredible to believe. But desperate times called for desperate measures. That evening, Harrison placed a call to his contact at the Pentagon. After explaining the situation and swallowing a considerable amount of pride, he requested assistance from any available specialist who might be able to help his team overcome their shooting problems. He expected to be assigned another military instructor or perhaps a retired sniper with extensive experience. The response he received the following morning was not what he had anticipated. A civilian contractor would indeed be arriving to work with his team. But this contractor was not the grizzled veteran soldier he had expected. Instead, he was informed that someone named Alex Morgan would be arriving Friday morning to assess the situation and begin remedial training. Harrison spent Thursday researching this Alex Morgan, but found surprisingly little information available through normal military channels. What he did discover intrigued and puzzled him in equal measure. Morgan had worked with multiple special operations units across different branches of the military, with consistently positive results. However, the specific methods used were classified, and the few testimonials he found were vague but enthusiastic. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that was perfect for shooting. Harrison had assembled his 12-man sniper team at 0600, prepared to meet their new instructor and hopefully begin solving the mystery of their missing marksmanship skills. The men stood at attention, their rifles cleaned and ready, their uniforms pressed despite the early hour. At exactly 0630, a dusty pickup truck pulled through the base gates and drove toward the training area. Harrison watched through binoculars as the vehicle approached, expecting to see a typical military contractor emerge, probably a middle-aged man with obvious military bearing and years of combat experience written across weathered features. Instead, the person who stepped out of the truck was someone who challenged every assumption Harrison had made about their incoming instructor. Alex Morgan was a woman, appearing to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, boots, and a simple flannel shirt that marked her immediately as an outsider in this world of military uniforms and rigid protocols. The SEALs exchanged glances, some trying to hide their surprise and others making no effort to conceal their skepticism. Rodriguez muttered something under his breath that Harrison chose not to hear, while Chen simply stared in obvious confusion. These men were accustomed to learning from instructors who looked like them, battle-hardened warriors with obvious military credentials and decades of combat experience. Morgan walked toward the group with an easy confidence that seemed unaffected by the dozen pairs of eyes evaluating her every step. She carried a single rifle case and a small backpack, traveling much lighter than most military instructors who typically arrived with extensive equipment and detailed training plans. Her approach was casual, almost relaxed, which stood in stark contrast to the rigid formality that typically characterized military training environments. Harrison stepped forward to meet her, his mind racing with questions and concerns. How was this civilian woman supposed to solve problems that had stumped 12 elite SEALs and their experienced leadership? What possible expertise could she possess that would be relevant to their situation? And perhaps most importantly, how was his team supposed to respect and learn from someone who looked like she belonged in a coffee shop rather than on a military base? As Morgan approached, Harrison noticed something in her eyes that gave him pause. Despite her casual appearance and civilian clothing, there was an intensity and focus in her gaze that was unmistakably familiar. He had seen that same look in the eyes of his most experienced operators. A calm confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of accomplishing, regardless of what others might think or expect. She extended her hand in greeting, her grip firm and direct. When she spoke, her voice was clear and professional, with no trace of hesitation or uncertainty. She thanked Harrison for requesting her assistance and asked for a brief summary of the problems his team had been experiencing. As she listened to his explanation, she nodded thoughtfully, asking occasional questions that demonstrated a deep understanding of the technical aspects of precision shooting. The SEALs listened to this exchange with a mixture of curiosity and continued skepticism. Some were impressed by her apparent knowledge of their field, while others remained convinced that book learning was no substitute for actual combat experience. The tension in the group was palpable as they waited to see how this unusual situation would unfold. Morgan finished her conversation with Harrison and turned to address the assembled SEALs directly. She introduced herself simply, without listing credentials or attempting to establish her authority through intimidation or displays of superior knowledge. Instead, she asked each team member to describe their recent shooting experiences and explain what they believed might be causing their difficulties. As the men shared their frustrations and theories, Morgan listened attentively, without interrupting or offering immediate solutions. Her approach was markedly different from most military instructors, who typically began training sessions by demonstrating their expertise and establishing clear hierarchies. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding each individual's perspective and experience. When the introductions were complete, Morgan suggested that they begin with a simple shooting exercise, so she could observe the team's current performance firsthand. The SEALs took their positions on the firing line, loaded their rifles, and prepared to demonstrate the same problems that had been plaguing them all week. As they settled into their shooting positions, each man wondered what this civilian instructor would be able to see that their own experienced leadership had missed. Alex Morgan stood behind the firing line with a pair of binoculars, watching as the 12 SEALs settled into their shooting positions. The morning air was still and perfect for precision shooting, with virtually no wind to complicate their shots. Commander Harrison stood beside her, clearly anxious to see whether she could identify problems that had eluded his own experienced eye. Rodriguez was the first to fire, his shot missing the target by nearly 6 inches to the left. He immediately began adjusting his scope, muttering about wind drift that didn't exist in the calm conditions. Chen followed with a shot that went high and right, prompting him to check his rifle's action for mechanical problems that weren't there. One by one, each SEAL fired with similar results, shots scattered around the targets with no consistent pattern. Morgan observed silently, making notes in a small notebook, but offering no immediate comments or suggestions. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing frustration visible in the shooter's body language. After watching the first round of shots, she asked each man to fire 2 more rounds, continuing to observe and document what she saw. By the end of the exercise, the results were predictably poor. Out of 36 shots fired by the team, only 9 had hit within the acceptable accuracy zone. The SEALs began cleaning their rifles and discussing possible equipment issues, but Morgan interrupted their analysis with a simple request. She asked Rodriguez if she could examine his rifle and scope setup. He handed over his Mk-11, somewhat reluctantly, clearly protective of his personal weapon. Morgan quickly field-stripped the rifle, examined each component carefully, and reassembled it with practiced efficiency. Her movements were confident and precise, demonstrating a familiarity with the weapon system that surprised the watching SEALs. After inspecting the rifle and testing the scope's tracking, Morgan announced that the equipment was functioning perfectly. The scope was properly mounted and zeroed, the rifle's action was smooth and consistent, and the ammunition was high-quality match-grade rounds. She repeated this process with Chen's rifle and Williams's weapon, reaching the same conclusion each time. The SEALs exchanged uncertain glances. If their equipment wasn't the problem, and the weather conditions were ideal, what could possibly be causing their accuracy issues? Morgan seemed to read their thoughts and asked permission to fire a few shots herself, using Rodriguez's rifle. Harrison nodded his approval, curious to see what this civilian contractor could accomplish with the same equipment that had been producing such poor results. Morgan approached the firing line and assumed a prone shooting position with fluid movements that immediately caught the attention of every SEAL present. Her body alignment was textbook perfect, and she settled into the position with a stillness that spoke of extensive training and experience. She made a few minor adjustments to the scope and spent several minutes studying the target through her optics. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the result was immediate and impressive. The bullet struck the target dead center, exactly where she had been aiming. Without comment, she fired 2 more rounds in quick succession, each one striking within inches of her first shot. The tight group she created on the target was exactly what the SEALs should have been producing with their level of training and experience. A murmur ran through the assembled SEALs. Chen shook his head in disbelief, while Williams stepped closer to get a better view of the target through his binoculars. Rodriguez stared at his rifle as if it had somehow betrayed him by performing perfectly for someone else. The demonstration had effectively eliminated equipment malfunction as a possible explanation for their poor shooting. Morgan stood up from the firing position and handed the rifle back to Rodriguez with a slight smile. She asked the team to gather around while she shared her observations from watching their shooting. Her approach was methodical and detailed, but delivered in language that was clear and non-threatening. She began by explaining that marksmanship was fundamentally about consistency and repeatability. Every aspect of the shooting process needed to be executed identically from shot to shot, creating a system that could produce predictable results. Small variations in any element of the process would be magnified at longer ranges, turning minor inconsistencies into major accuracy problems. The SEALs nodded along with this explanation, which was basic marksmanship theory that they had all learned years earlier. However, Morgan continued by pointing out specific inconsistencies she had observed in their shooting. Rodriguez had been placing his supporting hand in slightly different positions for each shot, creating variations in how his rifle was supported. Chen was breathing differently between shots, sometimes holding his breath longer or shorter than optimal. Williams had been gripping his rifle with varying pressure, unconsciously adjusting his hold based on his frustration level with previous shots. Several other team members were making subtle changes to their shooting positions between shots, shifting their body weight or adjusting their leg positions in ways that affected their stability. These observations surprised the SEALs, who prided themselves on their attention to detail and consistent technique. Morgan explained that these small variations were normal and happened to all shooters, but they became more pronounced under stress or when confidence was shaken. The poor shooting earlier in the week had created a cycle where frustration led to overthinking, which caused technique to break down further. She suggested a different approach to solving their accuracy problems. Instead of focusing on their equipment or external factors, they needed to rebuild their basic shooting fundamentals from the ground up. This would involve breaking down their shooting process into individual components and practicing each element until it became completely automatic. Some of the SEALs exchanged skeptical glances. These were experienced operators who had been shooting professionally for years. The idea of returning to basic fundamentals felt like a step backward, especially when they were facing an upcoming deployment where lives would depend on their accuracy. Morgan seemed to anticipate their resistance and offered to demonstrate her approach with one volunteer. Rodriguez stepped forward, perhaps motivated by the fact that she had just used his rifle to shoot a perfect group. Morgan asked him to assume his normal shooting position and go through his typical pre-shot routine without actually firing. As Rodriguez settled into position, Morgan knelt beside him and began pointing out subtle inconsistencies in his technique that were invisible to casual observation. His left elbow was positioned differently than during his previous shots. His right shoulder was carrying more tension than necessary. His cheek contact with the rifle stock was slightly different, which would change his sight picture. Rodriguez made the adjustments Morgan suggested and immediately felt the difference in his position. Everything seemed more stable and comfortable than it had been during his earlier shooting. Morgan guided him through his breathing technique, having him practice the exact timing of his breath control without firing a shot. Next, she had him practice his trigger control, dry firing the rifle while maintaining perfect sight alignment and breathing rhythm. She watched his technique carefully, making small corrections to his finger placement and trigger press. What seemed like minor adjustments to the SEALs watching created significant improvements in Rodriguez's consistency. After 20 minutes of this detailed practice, Morgan loaded a single round into Rodriguez's rifle and had him fire one carefully controlled shot. The bullet struck the center of the target, matching the accuracy of her earlier demonstration. Rodriguez stared at the target in amazement, then looked down at his rifle as if seeing it for the first time. The success of this single shot captured the attention of every SEAL present. Chen immediately volunteered to be the next student, followed quickly by Williams and the other team members. Morgan worked with each shooter individually, identifying and correcting the specific technical flaws that were affecting their accuracy. The process was methodical and time-consuming, but the results were immediate and dramatic. Each SEAL who received Morgan's individual attention saw immediate improvements in their shooting accuracy. More importantly, they began to understand how small variations in their technique were creating their accuracy problems. As the morning progressed, Morgan introduced several training exercises designed to rebuild and reinforce proper shooting fundamentals. These drills focused on creating consistent, repeatable movements that would become automatic under stress. Some exercises involved dry firing practice to perfect trigger control. Others emphasized breathing techniques and natural point of aim. One particularly effective drill required the SEALs to assume their shooting positions with empty rifles, then hold those positions for extended periods while focusing on perfect form. This exercise revealed additional technique problems that weren't obvious during live firing, such as gradual position shifts and muscle tension that accumulated over time. The SEALs found themselves working harder during these basic drills than they had during their previous live-fire sessions. The mental concentration required to maintain perfect consistency was exhausting, but the results spoke for themselves. When they returned to live firing after lunch, their accuracy had improved dramatically. Rodriguez's first 5-shot group measured less than 2 inches at 800 yards, a significant improvement over his scattered shots from earlier in the week. Chen managed to place 4 out of 5 shots within a 1-inch group, with his single flyer still hitting well within the acceptable accuracy zone. Williams and the other team members showed similar improvements, transforming from frustrated shooters into confident marksmen within a single training day. The transformation was remarkable. But Morgan cautioned against overconfidence. She explained that their improved accuracy was the result of conscious attention to technique details that needed to become completely automatic. The real test would come when they could maintain this level of accuracy while under stress or when distracted by other factors. To illustrate this point, Morgan introduced stress-inducing elements into their afternoon training. The SEALs had to complete physical exercises before shooting, fire from uncomfortable positions, and engage targets while dealing with simulated distractions. Initially, their accuracy suffered as they struggled to maintain their improved technique under these challenging conditions. However, Morgan's systematic approach proved its value during these stress tests. The SEALs who had internalized the fundamental improvements were able to maintain good accuracy even when challenged. Those who were still thinking consciously about their technique showed greater performance degradation under stress. As the day concluded, Commander Harrison was amazed by the transformation in his team's shooting performance. The same rifles and ammunition that had produced terrible accuracy earlier in the week were now delivering precision that exceeded their normal standards. More importantly, his SEALs had regained the confidence that was essential for effective performance in combat situations. Morgan gathered the team for a final briefing before departing. She emphasized that their improved shooting was not the result of any secret techniques or special equipment. Instead, it came from returning to fundamental principles and executing them with absolute consistency. She provided each SEAL with a detailed training plan for maintaining and further developing their newly refined skills. The SEALs thanked Morgan for her instruction, with several admitting that they had initially doubted whether a civilian contractor could help elite military operators improve their shooting. Her unconventional approach and obvious expertise had won their respect and delivered results that justified Harrison's decision to request outside assistance. 6 weeks later, Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez crouched behind a rocky outcropping in the mountains of Afghanistan, his rifle steady as he surveyed the valley below through his scope. The mission had taken an unexpected turn when their target, a high-value terrorist leader, had appeared at a compound 2 kilometers away from their planned observation post. The shot would be challenging even under ideal conditions, but the afternoon heat was creating mirage effects that made precise aiming extremely difficult. Commander Harrison lay beside Rodriguez, studying the target area through high-powered binoculars. The terrorist leader was meeting with several other individuals in a courtyard surrounded by high walls. Intelligence indicated that this was a rare opportunity to eliminate a target who had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces and Afghan civilians. The problem was the distance and environmental conditions. At 1,200 yards, this would be one of the longest shots any of Rodriguez's team had attempted in combat. The heat shimmer rising from the sun-baked rocks made target identification challenging, and variable winds in the valley below would affect bullet trajectory in unpredictable ways. Additionally, the target was only briefly visible as he moved between buildings, giving the shooter narrow windows of opportunity. Rodriguez felt calm and confident as he prepared for the shot, a stark contrast to the anxiety that had plagued him during training exercises just weeks earlier. The fundamentals that Alex Morgan had drilled into him and his teammates had become second nature, allowing him to focus completely on reading the environmental conditions and timing his shot perfectly. He settled into his shooting position with the fluid movements that Morgan had taught him, ensuring that every aspect of his body alignment was identical to his countless hours of practice. His breathing fell into the rhythm that had become automatic, and his trigger finger found its precise placement without conscious thought. The rifle felt like an extension of his own body, exactly as it should for an elite marksman. Through his scope, Rodriguez watched the target's movement patterns while simultaneously calculating the effects of wind and elevation on his bullet's trajectory. The heat mirage required him to aim slightly lower than normal, compensating for the optical distortion that could throw off even experienced shooters. He waited patiently for the perfect moment when all variables would align in his favor. The target emerged from a doorway and began walking across the open courtyard, presenting the clear shot that Rodriguez had been waiting for. In the final seconds before firing, Rodriguez applied the mental checklist that Morgan had taught him. Breathing controlled, natural point of aim confirmed, trigger finger placement perfect, sight picture crystal clear. Everything felt exactly right. Rodriguez squeezed the trigger with the smooth, consistent pressure that had become automatic through hours of practice. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder, and he immediately cycled the bolt to prepare for a follow-up shot if necessary. Through his scope, he watched as the target suddenly dropped to the ground, confirming a successful hit at the extreme range. The elimination of this high-value target would later be recognized as a significant intelligence victory, providing coalition forces with valuable information about terrorist networks throughout the region. But for Rodriguez and his team, the successful shot represented something more: personal proof that the lessons they had learned from Morgan had real-world value beyond training exercises. During the weeks following that successful mission, Rodriguez's team continued to apply Morgan's teachings in various combat situations. Petty Officer Chen used his refined marksmanship skills to provide overwatch during a dangerous reconnaissance mission, successfully engaging multiple targets at ranges exceeding 800 yards. His shots were precise and confident, eliminating threats before they could endanger his teammates on the ground. Sergeant Williams found that his improved shooting fundamentals helped him remain calm and accurate during a chaotic firefight when his team was ambushed while moving through a narrow mountain pass. Despite the stress and confusion of combat, his shots were controlled and effective, allowing his team to break contact and reach safety without casualties. The entire team noticed that their confidence in challenging shooting situations had improved dramatically since working with Morgan. They no longer second-guessed their equipment or worried about mysterious accuracy problems. Instead, they trusted in their training and focused on executing perfect shots when their teammates' lives depended on their precision. Commander Harrison documented the team's improved performance in his after-action reports, noting the significant enhancement in both accuracy and confidence that resulted from Morgan's unconventional training methods. He recommended that other special operations units consider similar instruction, particularly when dealing with marksmanship problems that seemed to resist traditional solutions. The success of Morgan's intervention with the SEAL team did not go unnoticed by military leadership. Within months, she was being requested by other special operations units facing similar challenges. Army Rangers, Marine Force reconnaissance teams, and Air Force special operations units all sought her expertise when their own marksmanship programs needed enhancement. Each assignment presented unique challenges, but Morgan's fundamental approach remained consistent. She focused on identifying and correcting small technical flaws that accumulated into major accuracy problems, particularly when teams were under stress or had lost confidence in their abilities. Her methods were always methodical and scientific, but delivered with patience and understanding that won over even the most skeptical special operators. Rodriguez later learned more about Morgan's background through conversations with other teams she had assisted. She had been a competitive shooter for over 15 years, winning numerous national and international championships before transitioning into military consulting. Her civilian background had actually been an advantage, allowing her to approach marksmanship problems from perspectives that military instructors might not consider. Her success with special operations units led to consulting opportunities with civilian law enforcement agencies facing similar challenges. SWAT teams, federal agents, and police sniper units all benefited from her systematic approach to rebuilding, shooting fundamentals, and restoring confidence in challenging situations. The techniques Morgan taught proved particularly valuable for operators who had to perform under extreme stress. Her emphasis on making proper shooting form completely automatic meant that correct technique would persist even when conscious thought was focused on other critical factors like target identification, threat assessment, and teammate coordination. Years later, when Rodriguez had advanced to become an instructor himself, he continued to use Morgan's methods when working with new SEAL recruits. He found that her approach was particularly effective with shooters who had developed bad habits or were struggling with confidence issues. The systematic breakdown of shooting fundamentals, followed by careful rebuilding and reinforcement, consistently produced dramatic improvements. The success of Morgan's intervention became something of a legend within special operations communities. Stories of the civilian woman who had fixed an elite SEAL sniper team's accuracy problems in a single day were passed along through informal networks of operators and instructors. While some details became exaggerated in the retelling, the core message remained accurate. Sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected sources. Rodriguez's team completed their Afghanistan deployment with distinction, achieving all mission objectives while suffering no casualties. Their marksmanship skills were consistently rated as exceptional, and several team members received decorations for their performance during critical missions. The confidence they had gained through Morgan's training had carried them successfully through some of the most challenging combat situations they would face in their careers. When the team returned to Coronado after their deployment, they found that their training experience with Morgan had become part of the unit's official curriculum. New SEAL sniper students were taught the same fundamental principles that had rescued the team from their accuracy crisis. The methods were incorporated into regular training protocols, ensuring that future operators would benefit from the lessons learned. Harrison, who had been promoted following his team's successful deployment, often reflected on the decision to request outside assistance when his unit was struggling. It had been a humbling experience to admit that elite military operators needed help from a civilian contractor, but the results had justified the decision completely. The lesson was clear: expertise could come from unexpected sources, and effective leaders needed to remain open to unconventional solutions. The story of Morgan's intervention with the SEAL team became a case study in military training programs, illustrating the importance of returning to fundamental principles when complex problems seemed resistant to obvious solutions. It demonstrated that sometimes the most effective approach was not to add complexity or seek external explanations, but to strip away complications and focus on perfect execution of basic skills. Rodriguez continued his military career for several more years before retiring to pursue civilian opportunities. Throughout that time, he maintained the shooting skills that Morgan had helped him rediscover, and he never again experienced the confidence crisis that had threatened his team's mission readiness. The lessons he learned during that single day of training remained with him for the rest of his career, influencing not just his marksmanship, but his approach to solving problems and overcoming challenges in all aspects of military service. The impact of Morgan's work extended far beyond that single SEAL team. Her methods influenced marksmanship training programs throughout the military, leading to improved accuracy standards and more effective instruction techniques. The principles she taught became part of the standard curriculum for special operations units, ensuring that future generations of elite operators would benefit from her insights and experience. The story serves as a reminder that expertise can come from unexpected sources, and that even elite military units can benefit from outside perspectives when facing challenging problems. It also demonstrates the importance of maintaining an open mind and being willing to accept help when traditional approaches are not producing desired results. Most importantly, it shows how returning to fundamental principles and perfect execution can solve problems that seem mysteriously complex on the surface.